We're going to go ahead and get started. And we're going to start off with some prayer. Oh, they're at VBS. So we're going to start off with prayer, not with VBS. We're going to start off with prayer, and I'll get it going here in just a minute. So just pray at your seats. Well, let's get a move on here. We will be doing our discussion questions, our question and answer night on August 27th. So just by way of review, we started last week talking about women in ministry and in leadership. And we saw that the Bible really is full of both good and bad examples of women in leadership and ministry. And so today we're going to start looking at some specific verses, and we will probably finish off this topic next week, probably. So I get probably the biggest point of contention isn't necessarily women in ministry or women in leadership broadly, But people start to get a little bit squirrely when we're talking about women as pastors, I think is where it really starts to rub people the wrong way. So I was hoping if there's someone who feels like sharing, is there anyone who does not think that women should be pastors or leaders or in ministry, and if so, why? Is there anybody here who wants to share? Or if you go the other way and you feel like maybe they should be pastors or leaders or ministers, and if so, why? Either way. No? Okay, just making sure. I figured with it being a smaller group tonight, might not get very far with that, but figured we'd give it a try anyways. We're at a bit of a precarious time in history because there's more opportunity for women to lead than ever, but women are less qualified than they've ever been. And what I mean by that is it's our character that gives us positions. You know what I mean? And the next generation of women they just have this attitude problem. They're very bitter. A lot of them are man haters. A lot of them are just disrespectful of authority. They just can't really be taught. And God doesn't really tend to use people who can't be taught. You know what I mean? So whereas women have more freedom than they've ever had, have more rights than they've ever had, well, let's not really talk about that too much, but they have probably the worst character that they've had in a very long time. And this is probably going to be one of those double-edged swords where, having the opportunity but not really having the character to fulfill it. And, well, I guess there's not much else we could say about that for right now. We'll stay on point. So, does anyone know what an argument from silence is? No? Okay. So an argument from silence is a type of fallacy. It's a type of logical fallacy. And the basic idea is that you draw a conclusion, so you come to a decision about something, because it's not mentioned in the source, or because there's no evidence for it. So I'll give you a couple examples because it might be a little bit hard to follow what I'm saying. One example is, well, Israel never wandered in the desert because there's no evidence for it. Well, what you mean to say is we haven't discovered any evidence for it. It's not like we've combed all the desert. But with that being said, there is evidence for the Israelites being in the wilderness, such as the Bible saying so. But even if you don't believe that kind of stuff, what they really mean to say, I think, is it's not the evidence we're looking for. Which brings up a really interesting question. How are you going to find evidence of the Israelites, a nomadic people, being in the middle of the desert? Like, they didn't have rappers. They didn't have, what would they have left? What evidence are you hoping to find? So a lot of times people kind of get, it's just proof that it's just a complete fabrication. That's a argument from silence. Another example is actually used as far as women leadership. Women can't be pastors because there are no biblical examples of women pastors. And that is true. There are no biblical examples of women as pastors. Does that mean that they can't be? An argument from silence. Or also, Paul never said that women could be pastors, therefore they can't. He didn't say one way or another, so you can't just come to a conclusion. So obviously, and I hope you see, but I'll ask it instead, what do you think might be some problems that could surface from this logical fallacy? Like, what do you think might be some oversight that people might miss when they try to prove a point by what's not said? Can you guys think of anything? Mm-hmm. Okay, so validating things that are obviously wrong. Okay. I would agree. Anything else? Oh, well, that's very true. But we definitely see homosexual pastors nowadays, don't we? Oh, my, oh, my. Mm-hmm. Right. Basically making an argument from the lack of evidence. You know. Mm. Yeah. 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 Which, that I've actually seen that happen in court sometimes, and the judge is like, wait, hold on. What actual proof do you have? And they're like, well, we've got this really good implication. It's like, well, yeah, but your implication is not going to be sealing this case. Yeah. Yeah, he did. It didn't go anywhere. He went on for like 10 minutes. I was like, what is this guy getting at? And then the judge brought that up. He's like, so is there actually, let's move this along. Is there any actual evidence that you're getting to? But anyways, obviously you guys are seeing some of the problems there. When you have insufficient data, you come to rash conclusions, and you might, say something that isn't actually warranted. So we're going to start off in Genesis 2. And we've kind of already hit on this before, but since we're talking about this topic, I wanted to kind of hit on it again. Genesis 2:18 says, then the Lord God said, it is not good for the man to be alone. I'll make a helper corresponding to him. And why I bring up this verse is because people who do not believe that women should be in ministry or in leadership or as service pastors, they bring up this verse to talk about the way that women are inherently inferior to men, that they are inherently subject to them, so therefore they can't possibly be a teacher or a pastor, because that would mean that they wouldn't be inferior to them. But the problem is that the word translated helper does not have implications of inferiority. It more is talking about the idea of someone who's an aid coming alongside of another person. It's actually the term that is used to talk about God. God is our helper. So if you want to make the argument that this word implies that a woman is inferior, you've got a problem, because you're also implying that God is inferior in our relationship, which I don't think any reasonable and rational Christian would make that argument, but you never know. So does this verse have any implications for leadership? And I'm going to say, not really. I guess you could say that we need men and women working together. I think that would be the only implication you could draw from this. I really don't think you can draw anything as far as women not having certain roles. So we get to Genesis 3:16, which is also used a lot of times in these arguments. He said to the woman, I will intensify your labor pains. You will bear children with painful effort. Your desire will be for your husband, yet he will rule over you. So, a lot going on there. But the thing that we need to ask before we even look at these verses is God saying the consequences of sin? Or is he saying the punishment from sinning? This is the difference. Is he saying when sin enters the equation, this is the thing that logically follows? Or is he saying because you disobeyed and followed me, I'm putting a curse on you? Well, we don't really know. It's not really specified. So I think it's important that we don't push it too far one way or another. A lot of times the older, more mainstream Protestants went to it's a punishment from God, and then other people in the more recent history have tried to go the other way and just say, no, it's just the consequences of sin, to try and rewrite God as being a loving God. And I think both sides have good and bad to their argument, but I think it's important that we don't rush to say for sure what God did not specifically clarify. But what this verse does show us is that man versus woman, this whole men hating women and women hating men thing, that's because of sin. It's not because of, just an inherent problem between man and woman. And I feel like we should be more honest when we're talking about how men and women treat each other. The issue why we're having issues is because of sin. That's it. Like there wasn't originally that antagonism there. And I think that the same thing is true for any time there's a church conflict or a conflict in a marriage or a conflict in employer-employee or among, family. Anytime there's any kind of thing like that, it's a sin issue is what it is. Sin is really the root of every problem that we're having. And I want to clarify that authority was not established because of sin. Sometimes people, the egalitarian more than anything, will argue that authority structures didn't originally exist. So men wasn't originally over woman. There was no authority structure originally because, everything was perfect, but it was introduced because of sin. I don't really think that's the point of what's being said here, because we see an authority structure established before sin is introduced. God makes the world and he says, man is over the creation. So there's already an authority structure of some sort there. And we already see God was a part of the equation, and we weren't equal with God just because we didn't have sin. So it seems to me like the most rational explanation would be that authority is not a product of sin. Rather, conflict in authority is because of sin. The reason why men and women are in conflict in that authority relationship is because of sin. And two translations I want to kind of quote from here. The New Living Translation says this: "You will desire to control your husband, but he will rule over you," seeming to imply that the issue is maybe twofold: the woman wanting to domineer the man, and the man also mistreating the woman in how he rules. It seems like that, is what that translation is saying. But the ESV says it like this: "Your desire shall be contrary to your husband, but he shall rule over you." And that one's maybe isn't quite so clear about whether the man is at fault at all. It's a little more ambiguous, I think. But either way, I think both these translations are kind of getting closer than how this has historically been translated. So when we look at history, human history, we can look at how men and women have treated each other, and we see that men have always ruled, haven't they? They've been the one who established all the empires. They're the ones who've been, building all the kingdoms, building all the castles. It's been men, historically speaking. Women haven't done that. And it's easy to say, well, that's the patriarchy for you. They've been holding the women down for as long as you can. I don't think it's that. I really don't. I think it has to do with the fact of men are just geared more for that. When's the last time you've been talking to a chick, any girl, and she says, hey, I really want to learn how to build a bridge. They just don't really talk about stuff like that. Meanwhile, men are like, hey, let's get some fireworks and blow up this toilet. They just think about things differently. And historically speaking, men have tried to very much so control women and kind of squash them down, and women have been very unsubmissive about it, historically speaking. So if we were to look at this verse in light of history, I think that it kind of translates itself. And that, men try to, beat a woman down, and women try to, be submissive towards men. I think you see that over and over again. Now, I am not of the opinion that all women should submit to all men. I don't see a biblical warrant for that. I know some people do. I don't. I see a biblical warrant for a wife submitting to her own husband. I see that as a biblical warrant. But anyways, the biblical solution that Paul gives us is not to do away with the patriarchy or all these different things. He gives us pretty much a twofold response to this. Women submit, men lead in love. Fix the problem. And I think that's telling, because if Paul wanted to say more, he probably would have said more, and he didn't. Which, once again, is a bit of an argument from silence, but it's also not, because what I'm saying is he could have said one thing about just do away with the system, and instead he gave us a different system of, women submit to your husband and men, so he's actually saying something about that. What's unclear is this a command in all situations for all time, or is it a consequence? This is where it gets kind of tricky when we're talking about women in leadership. do women, basically what I'm getting at here is do women for all time have to consider this verse anytime they're in any kind of a leadership position? Or is this more of something that has to do with the consequence between how an inevitable problem? And why that is important is because men and women are they're gonna have conflict, and they're not always gonna work perfectly. And we need to be aware of this, especially when a man or a woman is in leadership. There's gonna be some tension there, but there's gonna be tension anyways. And I think that's about as far as we can push this verse to say. I really don't think we can push it much further. So then we get to the law, and we're met with the next problem. Okay, so clearly women couldn't lead, couldn't be pastors or whatnot, because they were seen in the Old Testament as property, right? Well, I'm actually going to debate that a little bit. A good example of this is in Exodus 20. You could go all throughout the law to talk about this, but we'll just settle for one verse. There's no reason looking at 1,700 different verses. Exodus 20, verse 17 says, "Do not covet your neighbor's house. Do not covet your neighbor's wife, his male or female servant, his ox or donkey, or anything that belongs to your neighbor." Aha, says the modern-day feminist. You see, the issue is that women were seen as property, where they were seen as... So the Bible is an inherently sexist book, and trying to keep the woman down, and so on and so forth. So we shouldn't even take it into account when we are talking about women in leadership and ministry. I think that's taking a little bit too far. But there's a few things, and I'll try to hit these kind of fast. First off, we aren't under the law. So regardless of whether men were seen as property in the law, it's kind of irrelevant. Second issue is that just like with the issue of slavery, the law was written in a historical setting without condoning that setting, but still in that setting. For instance, how many verses are there in the law that condemn multiple wives? There aren't there. You know what I mean? Does that mean God's okay with having multiple wives? Well, in contrary opinion of my Mormon friends, no, I do not think that God is saying that at all. But I do think that getting rid of slavery would not have gotten rid of the problem, because the law was not meant to be a handbook for utopian society. It was meant to be something that showed men the problem of sin. That's it. So it made allowances for things that may not have even been moral for people to do, but still allowed for them, because that really wasn't the issue. Until you fix the heart, it doesn't matter. Because look, if you squash slavery, there's just going to be something else that comes up. If you squash one thing, there's another thing. So basically, Moses would have had to keep adding new laws to hit the new issues, because it was just putting paint on a turd. But if you get at the heart of a person, it doesn't matter all the different applications. You've gotten to the heart of it. And Paul kind of hits on this in the book of Philemon, where he's talking about the slave that should be let go. So anyways, we'll move on though. Historically speaking, man's role was to provide for and protect his household, and part of his household were things under his authority, under his protection, whether he owned them or not. Okay, when you came over as a guest to eat at somebody else's table, this was a sign of continued friendship. If I wanted to say, hey, let's continue a relationship together, best friends, I would invite you over for dinner. And that would be a statement of me welcoming you. That's kind of how the ancient Middle East works. Actually, Middle East nowadays is pretty similar in that aspect. But more of the story being, that person would be under the care of that household. Does that mean that while you're over there eating, that they would own you? Well, of course not. And I think that the same is being said here. When you look at something from the future looking back, with modern eyes, you're going to misunderstand what's being said. Let me come back to that in just a second. I need to make sure I didn't miss anything. Okay. So we can go ahead and move on to that. So anything, though, what I'm saying, when it is removed from its context and its culture, looks bad. Anything. There's going to be some things in 100 years that our grandkids are going to look back on and say, I can't believe they ever called themselves Christians and did that thing. I don't know what it is because I'm blind to it. But they sure will know about all the things that we did wrong, and they'll have perfect clarity on the issue because they're not a part of their culture. Of our culture. And so it'll seem weird to them because they're divorced from our culture. And that's why I say anything removed from context or culture looks bad. When you kick someone out of the church, how unloving for you to kick that person out of church. Well, hold on. Because why? Why were they kicked out of church? What did they do? What's the situation? Because there's parts in the Bible where it says, don't even talk to such a person as this. Don't associate with these people. Don't allow yourself to fellowship with these people. So the Bible talks about this, and yet nowadays that's seen as like the most unchristian thing that could ever happen. It's like, well, the context really does decide if that's unchristian. If you're throwing people out because you don't like them, versus you're throwing somebody out because they are consistently causing a problem and they refuse to submit themselves to the church leadership, well, that's a little bit of a different issue. Landlords look evil most of the time, because the renters are, oh, well, my landlord, he's Mr. Evil, Hitler. Meanwhile, they're trying to make ends meet too. You know what I mean? And yet they look, or sometimes it goes the other extreme. And if you were evicted, that must mean you were a bad renter. And it's not always that either. Another thing, God looks apathetic a lot of times. If we take away the Bible and we just try to get through life on our own understanding, there's going to be a lot of times that God looks apathetic in the way that he deals with things. Oh, well, if he really cared, he'd do, because we're not praying and reading the Bible, we're just coming to our own conclusions. A boss firing an employee looks really bad out of context. So does this verse or any other verse say that a man owns his wife by God's decree? No. There is actually no verse that implies or states that a man owns his wife. You could easily justify this verse by simply saying those were all the different things that were under his protection, whether he owned them or not. But I think it goes a little bit beyond that. I'm going to actually make the point that the husband does own the wife. Let me explain. I think husbands and wives both own each other. I think that Paul gives warrant to this when he says, your body is not your own, but it's your wife. And your wife's body is not her own, but it's yours. So, I think that there is a certain ownership there. I can kiss my wife, but I can't kiss another woman. Why? Because there's a certain bond there that's not with me and other women. So in that sense, yeah, I do think that spouses own each other and that they're not their own anymore. Obviously, don't push that too far. But you get the idea of what I'm saying. And so in that aspect, don't crave another person's belongings. If you're a dude and there's a chick that's married, doesn't even matter if you're married or not. Hands off. It's not. God will never give you a command that says, "Hey, I want you to get with that woman that's already married to that guy." It's never going to happen. Like that's not a biblical thing that's going to happen. And so, anyways. Now, obviously, though, we could make a more philosophical argument very briefly and say, well, women aren't, the things that you own aren't all equal. And I would agree, that's true, but there is still ownership. For instance, when you look at ownership of a dog versus ownership of a couch, there's very obviously difference there. And in value of a thing, there's a difference. But I'm not arguing for wives or husbands being slaves to another, but rather having responsibility. So what's the implication then from the law for leadership? Not really much of one. I think this is kind of a red herring when people bring this up about why women can't be pastors or can be pastors, either way. I think, though, if you were going to apply this, the implication would be protect those who you are responsible for. You know what I mean? Like if you're a pastor, serve the people that you have, not the people you don't have. You know what I mean? I think we could do something like that. Isaiah 3:12, and you could get through the prophets and talk about the way that there's female prophets. But we'll just focus on one specific verse that I've already talked about once, but once again, we're talking about this, so we'll mention it here too. Isaiah 3:12 says, "Youths oppress my people, and women rule over them. My people, your leaders mislead you. They confuse the direction of your paths." And so some people will quote this verse and say, see, obviously women ruling is a bad thing, obviously. So therefore, women shouldn't have any leadership position whatsoever. And I really don't think that's what's going on here at all. It doesn't say it's wrong for women to lead. It says that the men weren't leading. They weren't doing what was right. And if you read through chapter 3, it's very obvious what he's talking about. Like, let's, for instance, back up to verse 2. Heroes and warriors, judges and prophets, fortune tellers and elders, commanders of 50 and dignitaries, counselors, cunning magicians and necromancers. I will make youths their leaders, and unstable rulers will govern them. The people will oppress one another, man against man, and neighbor against neighbor. So he's going through these different things, and he's talking about the way that people aren't living in obedience to God. And so men aren't leading, and so it's making it where women have to lead because the women are doing, basically, the women are having to fill up the vacuum that the man isn't doing. He should be doing, and he's not. Maybe a modern-day application would be, hey, you've got a family, and yet you're not teaching your kids anything about God, and instead your wife is having to pick up all that extra burden. And so your kids have no respect for you, and they're also losing respect for your wife, too. I think maybe that would be a good modern-day equivalent. Everything was being flipped over, and women were having to do because men wouldn't. And I think, historically speaking, women have not had as big of a desire to want to lead, but that's another conversation. I will say that women who want to lead typically want to lead for different reasons than men want to lead. And I'll leave it there. But men and women are just a lot different in how they see problems and how they see solutions, and we'll just kind of move on from there. So the implication for leadership in this verse, it is immoral to neglect your responsibilities, but I don't think that talks about whether women can be pastors one way or another. Galatians 3:28, we'll spend some time in the New Testament here. Just 2 more verses. The one after this will be in for a while. But Galatians 3:28, we'll start there. There it is. And it says, there is no Jew or Greek, slave or free, male and female, since you are all one in Christ Jesus. Now, he's obviously not saying women and men don't exist anymore. Like, we are an androgynous being. That's not what he's saying. He's basically saying you're either saved or you're not saved. It's plain and simple as that. There is equality and unity in the body of Christ. We are all children of God. There's not like lesser children and more children. Maybe a good example of that would be Mormonism's very male-centric salvation. And the way that they, the man gets saved and he either allows his wife to get in or whatever. That's not really biblically allowed. They just kind of went off the deep end with that one. And verses like this tell us about that. So the New Testament encourages women in leadership. We looked at that last week. It encourages women in ministry without specific prohibitions for things like pastoring, but it is vague. It is vague, and so we're going to have to look at some verses very specifically because the temptation is a good word. The temptation is to see issues like this and then go to the other extreme with the argument of silence and try to make your state that it's okay for women to do it because Paul didn't specifically prohibit them. So it's important that we don't go to one extreme or the other, but we actually try to find out what the Bible has to say about it. And so the last verse we're going to look at tonight is actually 1 Corinthians chapter 11. And this is a bit of a lengthy one, so we'll try to do it kind of in order, I guess I should say. And just to kind of give a recap, Paul is going to talk here about women wearing head coverings in church and men not wearing head coverings in church. So he's going to give a couple arguments and kind of lay it out here. But there's a few things that are important to note. First thing to note, Paul is talking about the order of worship. He's not talking about order in a household, so like how you do things in your own house between husband and wife. He's not talking about that. He's also not talking about how things should work in society. He is trying to draw a specific lesson about worship with how the church relates to each other. Okay, that's the first thing. And I think before I even read anything, I think a really good example will show what Paul's about to tell us about women wearing hats. Or head coverings, head coverings. Would you think it is wrong for a man to get baptized in swimming trunks? What do you think? No? Probably doesn't look anything promiscuous or anything with that, right? We're probably okay. Especially if we go out to Bottomless Lake or something and we're doing a dunk there. Wear some swim trunks, have some fun afterwards, right? Now, let's kind of flip it around and say, okay, well, what about if a woman was getting baptized in a bikini? Are we still okay with that? Well, no, we're not. And I hope you guys are seeing how ridiculous that would be. of course, nowadays, you do have to be very clear about what to wear when you're getting baptized, because, there's certain colors of shirts that probably shouldn't be worn. Very, very, mistakes have been made. Let's just say that mistakes have been made. Wow. Anyways, women don't look at fashion like they used to a generation ago, and we'll just kind of leave it at that, because I have definitely seen some things that I did not want to see. Oh, wow. Anyways, but what my point is here is that women have to present themselves different than a man would. Okay? And that's what Paul's going to say, but we're just kind of building on in just a second. Another thing to keep in mind as we're reading this is remember that in the ancient world, hair for women was a sensual thing. Okay, to let your hair hang out, it was seen as sensual. So like if you had your hair hanging out, you were more likely to get guys to look at you, for instance. Okay, can I get what I'm saying there? And another thing to keep in mind is that upper class women would show off their hair with these really nice braids and stuff, which is going to come up again next week when we look at 1 Timothy. But so there was kind of a class issue too between the saved people who were upper class and got saved, trying to show off their beauty, versus people who were lower class and couldn't really afford to do that, and didn't really dress in the same way. There's a whole bunch of different things there. We'll just kind of keep it short there. And then the third thing, or I guess it would be the fourth thing that I want to mention before we read the passage is remember this is a cultural issue. This is not something that we can really relate to because we don't have the same issue going on right now. When's the last time that you've seen a woman let down your hair and you thought, Lord, forgive me? Probably never, because that's not really our culture. You know what I mean? Back in the day, women who had their skirts any higher than their ankles were seen as promiscuous. We just live in a different world, so we can't really directly relate to this issue, and that's the problem, is people get to things that are hard to relate to, and they say, I'm going to ignore all of it because I don't relate to any of it, and that's just not true. So it does something for us, but it's a cultural issue that he's talking about for church worship specifically. So now that we've gotten all that out of the way, let's start looking at this. It says in verse 1, Now I praise you because you remember me in everything, and hold fast to the traditions just as I delivered them to you. Verse 3, But I want you to know that Christ is the head of every man, the man is the head of the woman, and God is the head of Christ. So right there he's giving us a little bit of a clue. But what does head mean? Well, head can mean either source or authority. And scholars debate very heatedly which one it is. In this context, how it should be translated. But regardless of whether it's source or authority, the main idea here is to give honor to the one who is your spiritual head. Okay? So for women, that would be their husbands. For husbands, that would be Christ, so on and so forth. And so broadly speaking, we can summarize what Paul's about to say by saying, husbands, don't cover or hide Christ in how you worship. And we could say more broadly, wives, don't expose or shame your husbands in how you worship. And I think that was a good way of just kind of clarifying what he's saying before we get into the nit and gritty of it. But that brings up an interesting question. Can husbands then shame their wives and it's okay? Well, I don't really think that that's the issue, but if you want to go that way, it's less common for a husband to do things in a service and how he worships that shames his wife. It's more common for that to be something that the woman is doing in this context. And that's not really the issue that Paul's addressing in Corinth anyways. So then can wives shame Christ as long as they don't shame their husband? Well, no. Because here's the thing. In honoring your husband, you're showing honor to Christ. Because if you submit to your head, you submit to the head of your head then. That's how authority works. If I am, in the military, and I've got a staff sergeant over me, okay? So I'm going to submit to him knowing that in doing so, I'm actually submitting to the general and the President of the United States. That's how authority works. It flows like that. So, no, I don't think there's ever going to be a hypothetical situation where you can shame Christ, whereas also not shaming your husband. I don't think that's the thing. So let's get back on track here. I want you to know that Christ is the head of every man, the man is the head of the woman, and God is the head of Christ. And then we get to verse 4. Every man who prays or prophesies with something on his head dishonors his head. Every woman who prays or prophesies with her head uncovered dishonors her head, since that is one and the same thing. One and the same as having her head shaved. So, what's going on here? Well, what Paul is talking about is there's a name for it. I'm not going to bother remembering it, but the basic idea is it's called a ridiculous. You guys heard that, right? It's like yeah. All right. It's called a ridiculous argument is basically what it is. And he's trying to prove a point. So maybe if I say it in my own words, it'll help you see what Paul's trying to say. These people who don't want to cover their heads, why not just go ahead and remove your sensual hair so there's nothing covering your head? It's a ridiculous argument. He's not actually saying do this. It's a way of making your point using a ridiculous extreme of what your opponent is saying. So they're saying they don't want to put their hair up, and he's trying to show the ridiculousness of it. So he says this, every woman who prays or prophesies with her head uncovered dishonors her head, since that is one and the same as having her head shaved. So then we get to verse 6, and it says this. For if a woman does not cover her head, she should have her hair cut off. But if it is disgraceful for a woman to shave her hair, to have her hair cut off or her head shaved, let her head be covered. So basically, I've indulged in your foolishness. Now just cover the hair. All right? Gee whiz. So here's the thing. You got to kind of clarify some things, because I think people will more or less kind of come to their own conclusions. So let's kind of move forward, and I'll try to clarify things as we go. Verse 7 then picks up and says, a man should not cover his head because he is the image and glory of God. So too, woman is the glory of man. So hold on. Are you saying that women are not the glory of God, or somehow they're not the image of God? Oh, no. That's not what he's saying at all. Both are made in the image of God. Genesis makes that clear. But their roles and their nature are different. Men and women are different. Women, for instance, wear makeup. Why do women wear makeup? Well, largely to please men. They are the glory of men. They largely do it for men. Do men wear makeup to please women? No, they don't. They don't even really do anything. They get up, they get dressed, they go. Well, most of us don't even have like a face cleaning routine. I mean, we just, here we are, warts and all. So right there, obviously don't push this too far, but the point being here that men and women operate differently. But then you get to, he says here, a man should not cover his head. And this gets a little bit confusing so I'll try to say this in unconfusing terms, but at the end, ask me if you have any questions. Basically, a man's hair was not seen as sensual, but a woman's hair was seen as sensual. And by nature, men did not really cover their hair very much, especially in Roman society. Really, people didn't wear head coverings. You had Roman soldiers that would wear the helmet. You had field laborers that would wear those, like, kind of just, they look kind of goofy, but they were basically the equivalent of those straw hats that you see people in. And you had, I mean, that was pretty much it. You really didn't have men wearing hats very much. It just wasn't a part of Roman culture. So when we look at verses like this, he's appealing to the culture that he's living in. This is not true of every culture. It's true in the culture that Paul is talking about. So don't try to push it too far. But the idea that he's getting at is men's hair is not sensual, and they didn't cover it in Roman culture just by nature of how things were going. So then is it wrong for men to wear hats in church nowadays? Well, I would say no, and I'd say there's a couple different things. First off, remember this is a cultural issue, just like women are not expected to cover their heads right now, right? I mean, I don't think I'm expecting any of you guys to cover your heads. In the same way, it would be kind of ridiculous to then go to the other extreme and say that men shouldn't cover their heads. That's not really what he's talking about. So that's my first thing. As a cultural issue. A second issue, men didn't wear hats like they do nowadays, so that's not really what Paul's addressing. And then there's a third thing that was called hat-etiquette. You guys heard this term? Hat etiquette. It didn't really actually seem to appear to exist at this time at all. Hat etiquette really got going after the medieval ages and really reached its highlight around, I want to say, like the Victorian era and stuff like that. So you had, like, in the 1600s and 1700s, it was a big thing, and it kind of carried over a little bit, and it's still kind of a thing with, like, the military. But by and large, if you look at society at large in America, it's really not as big of a role. In Europe, it's still a big thing in some parts, but in other parts it's not. So it's really just kind of. Let me say it like this: if you go and plant a church in Africa, and you're telling people who've never heard about Jesus, this is an isolated tribe, they've never even encountered other people, and everybody in the tribe shaves their head, men or women, everybody. Are you going to go there and it's going to be one of the things you're going to have to teach them how the women shouldn't shave their heads? Well, no, obviously not. And I hope you see what I'm saying about that. It's a cultural issue, and here we have a different cultural issue than what Paul is dealing with here. But he's not talking about hat etiquette. So he's not saying men can't wear hats. He's saying men typically don't wear hats, and Paul is appealing to this custom to prove his point that men don't cover their heads. So then, hold on, isn't every word the word of God? Yes, but it applies differently to different people in different situations. We're not saying this passage is no longer the word of God. We're saying the situation has changed, so we have to apply it a little bit differently. Just like with the Old Testament law. Don't get rid of the Old Testament law, but neither should you try and fulfill it like it is now. We're not Jews, right? We're Christians. But we can take from that and learn principles from that are important principles to learn, but still we're not held to the law itself. So, what I have noticed happens, and there's entire books and stuff that have been written about this, but the way that people try to make traditions, it's a very unfortunate thing. You could really go down the rabbit hole when we look at how it develops, but basically what Christians do is they try to impose traditions when they've lost their meaning because they think that the thing itself is immoral. See what I mean? So we need to establish this and keep doing this, and we don't know why we're doing it, but surely it's immoral in and of itself. People do this, going back to the example of hats. Hats in church are immoral. Well, if you wanted to make that argument from this verse, you'd also have to say that the women have to be wearing hats when they're in church. So the very act of wearing a hat couldn't possibly be immoral because a woman would have to do it. See what I mean? You can't have a one-sided standard and just pick and choose something from a tradition and then say it's a moral issue, and it's not, So let's kind of move forward here. To the next verse there, 8 and 9 says, For man did not come from woman, but woman came from man. And verse 9, neither was man created for the sake of woman, but woman for the sake of man. And then just to make sure that nobody misquotes what he's saying, he clarifies and gives a little bit of stipulations in verse 11. Look at this. In the Lord, however, woman is not independent of man, and man is not independent of woman. For just as woman came from man, so man comes through woman, and all things come from God. So you have modern-day feminists that actually talk about this verse without even knowing that they're talking about it. And the woman will say this, we created men, so we don't need men. And then the anti-feminists on this side will be like, yeah, but you used a man to make that child. And it's like, okay, but you guys are both missing the greater point, and that's verse 11 here. In the Lord, however, a woman is not independent of man, and also, man is not independent of woman. For just as woman came from man, so man comes through woman, and all things come from God. So Paul does this a lot of times, and I feel like we miss it because we're not really paying attention to what he's saying because we're just kind of lost with the whole hats. So he'll say something, and he'll know that it has limitations and you shouldn't push it too far or make it apply outside of what he's trying to prove it for. So he'll say this little addendum at the end of what he says. But a lot of times when people are reading verses like this, they skip the addendum. So he gave us in verse 7 and verse 8 and verse 9 talking about women and why women should cover their head and why men shouldn't. And then he goes to verses 11 and 12 and basically says, don't push that too far. Don't try to push that to the logical extreme that you're probably trying to. Let's kind of keep things in order here. So neither is independent of another, man nor woman, neither is independent, but rather woman was created because her strengths were man's weaknesses. Women were created because men did not have their strengths. That's the idea of what Genesis was talking about there, where he says he needs a helper. These are his strengths. I created him to be this, and this is his area but he's got some things that he's not quite getting. Woman is that. A lot of modern society is women trying to be men, trying to prove that they're powerful and capable, when women should actually be trying to be women, because women are unique, and a man cannot be a woman. Oh, I heard a pastor say it like this: the best dad in the world is a terrible mom. And I think that's a perfect way of summarizing it. No matter how good of a dad or a man or whatever you are, a man of God, you will never be a good mom as a man. You're just never going to be able to do that. Like, you can provide for your kids and do the best as you can in the case of like divorce or your wife dying or whatever, but you're never going to be able to take that place. And so I feel like we shouldn't even try to lie to each other about this. That's not what we're getting at all. So moving forward, meanwhile, women were created for a man's sake. He was not created for the woman's sake. See, man was created to do the thing that God called him to do. This is what this verse is literally just said. But, I was thinking about something. I don't think I want to talk about that tonight, but it caused me to lose my train of thought. When God made woman, he did it to fulfill something that man was not doing. So in other words, she was created for his sake. God looked at the man that he made and he says, hey, he needs a woman. But he didn't make a woman and say, hey, she needs a man. See what I mean? So keep that in mind when we're going through here. So then woman is the glory then, or the prize of a man. She is the pride of a man, if you would. Think about the way that men just love to look at women. I don't mean that in a dirty way. But men enjoy a physical woman's, essence or whatever you want to say. They like that women are pretty. And men are able to discern a woman's attractiveness. You know what I mean? Like, oh, she's attractive. And that's kind of, once again, don't push this too far. I'm not saying women can't think men are attractive. That's not what I'm getting at. But what I am getting at is woman is the pride of a man, if you will, the glory of a man. Whereas man is the glory of God. Now, obviously not solely the image of God. That's not what Paul is saying. I mean, in that sense, woman is the glory of God too. So don't push that too far. But rather, he's just trying to show about how there are some things that women should be doing and some things that men shouldn't be doing just because of the difference of nature. Like, for instance, a woman not wearing a bikini when she's getting baptized. Whereas if a man wore a bikini when he was getting baptized, it would be awkward. Oh, that would be awkward. But it wouldn't, tempt anybody to sin. You know what I mean? They'd be looking at that and be thinking, oh, my goodness, get that man a towel. He needs a towel. You know what I mean? But it's not going to tempt somebody to sin. They're not going to look at that and say, oh, baby. They're going to think, ugh. And that's kind of the point that I'm trying to make here. So don't push it too far with what he's trying to say. And you could even say it like this: women shouldn't try to turn heads in church. When you come to church, it's not the place for you to try to turn heads. If you're an attractive woman, that's even worse. If you're an upper class woman, that's even worse. When you come to church, your goal is not to try and turn heads. And that's what Paul's getting at. That's the whole root of what he's talking about here. Maybe a modern day example, Paul would say something about women wearing short shorts in church rather than women wearing head coverings. Because, once again, a different culture, but the same application. Don't try to turn heads. But there is a second interpretation that was made known to me by Craig Blomberg. I don't know who came up with it. That's worth mentioning. I don't think this is the right one, but I'll mention it to you guys instead. Anyways. And the idea is that he's not talking about head coverings, but the hair itself as being a covering, in which case men growing out their hair was a sign of homosexuality in Rome. Obviously, that's not necessarily the case now. I still don't like the way that it looks when men have, really long hair, I'm not talking about terms of, think Jason. I don't know what I'm talking about that. I'm talking about when they have, the man bun, with the... And you can tell that they just spend too much time on their hair, and they're just it's okay, come on. Come on. But that's kind of my own personal preference. I guess you could say back in the day, homosexuals maybe used to have longer hair, maybe, but nowadays not really so much. I've actually found that homosexual men nowadays tend to have very well-groomed hair. There's a term for it. What? Metrosexual, that's a term. Just real, their nails are well done, their hair is nice and trimmed, their beard, just everything's perfect. It's like they look in the mirror every single day or something. But back then this wasn't really the case. And the women, on the other hand, would have had two problems. The first is that a woman who cut her hair short would have been a sign of lesbianism, which actually hasn't changed that much. A lot of lesbians nowadays actually wear their hair short. Not to say you can't wear your hair short. Because actually I've had a lot of older women come up to me and say, am I sinning in cutting my hair short? No, you're not. No, you're not. Let's just get over it now. But then the second issue is that married women did something to kind of show that they were off the market, and that's that they wore a certain kind of hair covering. So basically the argument would be here, don't Don't try to get attention for yourself by refusing to wear your head covering while you're in worship. But it is important to note before we move on through 1 Corinthians that yarmulkes were not in use at this time. So they don't really have anything to do with this discussion one way or another. I know some people have tried to bring it up, but yarmulkes! No, that was, I believe, 200 or 300 years later, so it really doesn't apply. Moving on from there, it says in verse 10, this is why, and this gets very confusing, this is why a woman should have a symbol of authority on her head because of the angels. Well, what does that have to do anything with Paul? Well, there's three basic explanations. The first one is the one that I believe is true. I'll give you the other two. The first one, angels are in worship with us, and basically when you do things that shame in that sense, you risk God's wrath. When you're doing things that you shouldn't, it could possibly bring God's wrath in the way that the angels are there and they see and they report to God. So that seems the most likely to me. The second most likely one, in my opinion, is basically, you know when you're gonna eventually have a position over other people, you don't yet, but you're going to in the future have a position over a certain group of people, how you might want to watch your public image to those people. Like, let's say, for instance, I'm going to be a king over you guys, okay? And so I'm not the king right now, but I want to make sure that I don't get drunk around you and do a bunch of dumb stuff, because when I'm your king, it might just kind of come back to bite me. Not unlike what's happened over the past couple years in politics in America. Kind of similar to that. And so then the argument would then be, because we're going to eventually be over the angels, don't do things that would bring you shame later, is the basic argument. I don't feel like that one's as... I really don't feel like that. It could be, but I'm just not seeing it. And the third one, which I see is completely wrong, because it's based off of a misunderstanding of both angels and Genesis, is that basically don't cause the angels to lust after you. And this is based off of the idea that, angels supposedly had relations with women, and that's what caused the Nephilim back in Genesis chapters 6 or whatever. And I just don't really see that, because I really don't think Genesis is saying that, but I've already taught on that verse at least 2 different times here. And so it really depends on you misunderstanding that verse. Now, you could say, well, at that time, the ancient church believed that. And you could have a little bit of a warrant there, I guess, but I'm just not seeing it. So you move from there, and we can hop to verse 13, since we've kind of already covered the verses between 7 through 12. And 13 says, "Judge for yourself. Is it proper for a woman to pray to God with her head uncovered?" So he's hitting these different arguments. He's appealed to nature, the natural order of society. He's appealed to creation. And now he's going to appeal to just human nature itself, I guess is what you could say. "Judge for yourself, is it proper for a woman to pray to God with her head uncovered? Does not even nature itself teach you that if a man has long hair, it is a disgrace to him, but that if a woman has long hair, it is her glory? For her hair is given to her as a covering." Let's stop right there for a second. It's important to note that the pagan prophetesses, the pagan women prophets of the day, they would do this kind of thing where they would reveal their hair and kind of let it flow, and kind of make a whole spectacle about it, and go into these little incoherent ramblings and whatnot. So basically, he would kind of be alluding to that and say, is it proper for a woman to pray to God with her head uncovered? Is it proper for a woman who's saved to be doing this kind of stuff? And another issue to keep in mind is, for the Greeks, there was this idea of a perfect being, something that we were all kind of hoping to attain. And in this aspect, it is like a perfect androgynous being, something that is neither male nor female, but more than. Think of the ancient version of a transgender, something that is more than simply male or female, but both androgynous. And obviously, we see nowadays and we think, well, that's silly. But for them, this would have been a thing. So the question being, does salvation into the name of Christ, does that salvation further our pursuit of becoming that perfect androgynous being? And if so, do I have to let go the things that make me a woman or the things that make me a man? See what I mean? Just kind of letting it go to become my androgynous being. You know what I mean? So in that case, they might have thought that they didn't have to follow the standards and customs of women in their culture because, hey, I am saved now, I am more than. So when I come in here to worship, I can let my hair flow. See what I mean? And obviously, I don't really think that Paul's on board with that. So then verses 14 through 15 where it says, does not even nature itself teach you? It's interesting that women's hair grows longer easier. And historically speaking, women have tended to wear their hair longer than men. But obviously, this thing that he's saying here doesn't apply to every single situation. For instance, Nordic culture, men had longer hair. Barbarians, men had longer hair. And there's also the Jewish Nazarites, which, when they took their vow, the men would not cut their hair. And you have situations like Samson, where his hair was very long. So obviously, Paul is not saying something that is true in every situation. He's just trying to make an appeal so that the women that he's talking to won't act promiscuous in church. That's really his whole goal here. He's trying to make an argument to do that. And so obviously, and that's why he gives so many addendums in what he's saying. He's not trying to, make you follow something that he's not saying. He's rather just trying to give a biblical warrant for it. And he uses cultural examples to prove his point. So then you get to the last verse, and it says this in verse 16. If anyone wants to argue about this, we have no other custom, nor do the churches of God. So as a kind of a catch-all term, he just, or not term, phrase, he lands on this. And the idea is, and these people are still in abundance today, but these are the skeptics. In Greek culture, basically, they wouldn't believe something unless basically everybody believed in that thing. Everything, nowadays they've moved into the term of hyperskepticism, where it doesn't matter how much proof you show them, they don't want to believe it, and all these different things. Well, Paul also had people who did that too, and no matter how much he argued or showed scripture, they still were going to try and come up with I'm more spiritual than Paul, so I can, I don't have to follow these things. And so he just kind of lands on this and says, look, if anyone wants to argue, if anyone wants to be contentious about this, we have no other custom. There's no other way that we deal with this. And nor do the churches of God. This is how we're dealing with it. In other words, no matter where we are, wives are not going to be, or women in general are not going to be promiscuous in church. We're not going to do that. We're just not. So, for the skeptics who only believe that things are true, if they're true universally, and they still want to argue, just shuts them down here with this last point. He tried to reason with them, but if you're not going to see reason, this is just how it's done. You know what I mean? Have you ever? Here's a good example, great modern day example. You tell your kids to do something, and say why, and they're you're going back and forth or whatever, and you say, look, because I said so. How about that? All right, now go do it. It's kind of like what Paul's saying here. Look, I've been reasonable. I talked to you. This is how we do it. And now he's not saying that the church would never allow for anything different in the future. He's saying this is how they're doing things right now. This is how we're doing things. And so whereas the situation itself has changed, where women no longer have to wear head coverings and men no longer have to not wear head coverings, it's not really a thing in our culture, in our society. The principle that he's teaching is still true. You should not shame your spouse while you're in church. Okay, this is nobody else's business. And so, like, for instance, how Melissa goes on the stage is going to be different because she's married to Jason versus how I go on the stage because I'm not married to Jason. That kind of makes sense. But I hope you get my point. So the main point of all this, in case you got lost in all the details and all the history setting, to show honor to your spiritual head in what you do. Whether you are worshiping, whether you are praying, whether you are prophesying, show honor to your spiritual head in what you do. Don't dress in a way so as to disgrace your husband or tempt others. Don't do that. I always say for my secretary, and actually the two secretaries I had before, they couldn't wear anything that showed anything as far as cleavage. You got up here. Nothing that goes too short. It doesn't look good. I don't need the added temptation anyways. And, it's just, this is church. This isn't like, whatever. So we have a dress code. And so this is really the basis of that kind of thinking for me. And so does this have an implication for women in leadership? I would say women cannot lead as a man would. I think that's how you can apply these verses that we've just looked at. Women and men, I think, can both be leaders, but they have to go about it differently. A woman has to be more sensitive to certain social rules and customs and cultural issues than a man would. For instance, it's going to be typically very easy for a man to become a missionary and go to foreign countries. It's going to be much harder for a woman to do it. Much harder. A great example of that, go to a Muslim country as a woman and try to be a missionary. You can do it. It's very difficult. Very difficult. And whereas as a man, you're going to have less difficulties. And I think that kind of proves the point of what I'm trying to get across, is that just men and women can do the same things. It just, they have to do it differently. They can't try to mimic one another. They have to play to their own strengths. Maybe a modern day problem that you could relate to this, if Paul wrote the epistles nowadays and he was trying to deal with a modern day problem, he might say something about the way that in churches, almost all churches have a raised platform with stairs that get to it. And he might bring up the verse about how you don't have an altar with the stairs that go up to it. And he might make the point of how that could potentially reveal your undergarments if you're not paying attention as you're walking up. And you have to hold your skirt a certain way, or, whatever. And not that there's anything, once again, immoral with the steps up to the thing. That's not the issue. The issue is that it wouldn't cause someone to sin. Paul seems very conscious about the idea of Christians watching out for each other. If there's someone who's a weaker Christian, try to help them to get stronger, but also don't just throw them out to the wolves. If you're a stronger Christian, that means that you should be more forgiving, not less forgiving. And so he talks about a lot of things like that, and I think that would be a good example where we can all agree that wouldn't be a moral issue. It's not like stairs are immoral to have in a building, but yet there could be negative implications to it. And I think that's all that Paul's talking about here. It's not a moral issue he's talking about. There is a negative implication in his culture that he's trying to address that might not be great to let go. So in summary, nothing thus far that we've read in Scripture would imply a woman is inferior, nor that she is incapable. So next week we're going to look at, we're going to end our discussion on women in leadership. I already have everything ready to go for it. So are there any questions on tonight? Sure, go ahead. It's easier for women to be in ministry if they're not married? Okay, explain. Sure. Okay. Mm-hmm. It changed. Yeah. Yeah. Right. I really wish I would have thought to give you the microphone for that, because that was really good. I'll try to summarize the things that you said. That it's easier for a woman to be in a ministry position, especially a lead ministry position such as pastor or missionary, if she's not married, and that's what you feel like what Paul was talking about with the whole, it's easier if you're not married to be in ministry, and then how you talked about the way that some women who are called have had to abandon that calling as they've gotten saved because they're now under their husband's authority and his direction. Did I hit all the main points you were saying? Sure. Mm. Yeah. Yeah. I mean, yeah, I totally get that. When men are not actively providing for the household, it does something to the way that they think and see problems. Yeah, I would totally agree with that. Another thing I would like to point out is, I guess not point out, but add on to that, is I had a pastor friend who his wife was a pastor, and so they tried out for a church, and she was the one who got the pastorship at that church. And so they talked about the way that it had its own difficulties, and I think you really have to work well together. But where at church she was the pastor, and he had to step back and let her be the pastor, and then at home she had to step back and let him be the husband. And I agree. That sounds like that just sounds like a mess. All that just sounds terrible. I don't want to do that. Not it. Don't get licensed, please. And then, it's a bad day when you get fired from a church as a pastor and your wife gets hired as your replacement. No! But anyways, okay, yeah. So any other questions or comments for this? We're all good? Okay. So then we'll finish up talking about women in leadership next week. And I changed that on here. I guess I didn't change it on there. I hate when I forget to do that. It's supposed to say the men's breakfast is on Saturday. It does not say that. It says that the first responder luncheon is coming up. But no, the first responder luncheon is not coming up. We gone done did that. It's over. So pretend like it says men's breakfast. We have a men's breakfast here on Saturday at 9. And later on in the month, I want to say it's the last Saturday, if I remember correctly. We'll have it in the bulletin, though. We will have a shooting day where all the men are going to go shooting over at the Nayas. If you need bullets, we can get a discount price on them, so please let us know before then. And, yeah, we can hook you up with the deal. So, okay. That's it. Can I have somewhere closes in prayer? One of you guys, somebody? Amen. Thanks. Have a great rest of your night, guys.